So bigger muscles doesn't necessarily equal stronger muscles. It's a combination of both. But perhaps people need to think about it in terms of, well, what's the stimulus for growth? And is it fatigue? So yes, the blood flow restriction will grow muscle to the same extent as high load training. You have a sort of 2 kilogram dumbbell and you could just lift that all day. And then you put a blood pressure cuff on, plate it, and then you're struggling after 15 reps.
Hi there and welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now my name is Dr. Steve Ingham, performance scientist by trade and training. And in these discussions with performance experts, practitioners and performers, I explore how we deliver performance, how we support others to perform, and the underpinning knowledge and concepts at play. I really hope you enjoy the conversations from today's episode or from the back catalogue. And if you do, it'd be great if you can take a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, or for the audio, take a moment to leave a review. It really helps the show. Right, let's get into the discussion. Welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, in this conversation, I talk with Dr. Richard Ferguson, or Ferg, a reader in exercise physiology at Loughborough University. We dive into a specialism of Ferg's, the science of blood flow restriction training. We discuss its effectiveness, the mechanisms behind it for rehabilitation, for strength and endurance sports. We discuss the practical applications of how, where, when you might integrate this innovative training method and the nuances of its use within an athlete's training cycle, maybe from base phases to peaking, and consider its current uptake and understanding amongst athletes and coaches. And because it's an innovative training method, naturally there are plenty of, well, it depends, and we don't know yet, alongside the encouraging evidence that this could be a really useful training tool. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Richard Ferguson, or as affectionately known to everyone, Ferg. How are you?
I'm really good, thanks, Steve. Yourself?
I'm all good. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
And we've had many over the years, really, which I'm really keen to sort of open up, but also get a bit of an update from you and just get into that idea of what's the latest thinking around this blood flow restriction area. But before we do that, give us your bio, give us your intro. Where have you come from?
Yep. Okay. So currently I'm a reader in human and exercise physiology here at Loughborough University. Prior to that, I did my undergraduate degree at University of Birmingham, a master's at Birmingham, and then I went to Manchester Metropolitan University to do my PhD in muscle physiology and exercise efficiency. I was fortunate at that time to spend a year in Copenhagen in the August Krogh Institute, Copenhagen Muscle Research Centre with Jens Bangsbo, so I had a formative year there. From that, I went to Strathclyde University and then came down to Loughborough, and I've been here for 17 years.
Is that long?
Yes, it is. It is indeed.
I can see you're accumulating purple files behind you, but
African violet, of course.
That's the one. Whatever. Yeah. So, and you're in the hotspot of sport, but equally you wear the badge of going to Copenhagen and having that intense experience. That's like playing for Real Madrid for a year.
Yes, it certainly was. It was fantastic experience.
So super interesting background, and we've had these sorts of ongoing conversations probably for in excess of 17 years around this idea of restricting blood flow or occlusion. We can get into sort of maybe what it is in a moment, kits, safety protocols, what to use it for, what function or what purpose. But I suppose it's worth maybe giving the context around that sort of bang for your buck, really, and then the idea behind the conversations where we started having just sort of scratching our heads and having coffee conversations to say, you know what, I'm not sure about all of these recovery methods shortcutting the regeneration or recuperation post-exercise. I'm just not sure it's helping the signaling, which now seems to have come out quite maturely. And flipping the conversation to, is there any way of, rather than sort of just getting back to normal as quickly as possible, of actually increasing the signal, increasing the adaptation? The input of the training coming in, we want to try and get more response out of that.
Yeah, it was exactly that, and it was over a coffee, and I remember it very very well. And I think it boils down to, yeah, these recovery sort of methods were part of the conversation, but we can take it back further in the sense that there's a really good body of knowledge now, and it goes back to the 70s and 80s, where if you're well trained, you have a sort of dampened
Yeah,
adaptive response. And in the last 15 years, that's been reflected in some very interesting data, molecular biological data, and training data, where if you're already adapted, you have a large number of capillaries surrounding the muscle fibers, or you have a large density of mitochondria. To switch the signals on to induce those adaptations, if you're well trained, those signals are depressed. So you do the same amount of work and you don't get the same training response in following exercise. So our conversations was, yeah, these recovery systems, these recovery sort of techniques are good for recovering in that sense, but yeah, do they maintain this adaptive response within the muscle tissue? And you quite rightly say, well, actually, we might need to find ways to augment those physiological and molecular signals to enhance the adaptation in well-trained athletes. And that sparked the conversation around, well, what are there? And you gave us some really useful anecdotes around some of the athletes that you worked with that they would finish, I don't know, a sort of hard 800-meter set and then crouch down.
yeah,
I think I've got a recollection of that, and they would sort of
that's right.
crouch down and start and effectively occlude their legs, occlude the blood supply to the legs. And you got thinking, and that married up with my interest at that time with blood flow restriction. And we said, well, is there something in there? And as you said, we scratched our heads and we said, well, possibly. There's some good hypotheses around that, so let's have a look.
Yeah,
And that's what we did.
and that if I draw it back to the sort of first principles behind it, if you get fitter, you have to train a bit harder.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
And so you have to up the ante.
yeah,
Um, and probably to advance that example, a certain multiple Olympic champion endurance runner that we've worked with over the years first went to altitude and didn't quite respond because it was too stressful. So we had to change a few things around with that. Then got them responding to the altitude stimulus. And then as they became more and more familiar with altitude, rather than just going to altitude, sleeping and training there, we actually had to take hypoxic tents to altitude to up the ante.
yeah,
And so this is sort of part of this around enhancing the training
yeah,
stimulus, but also
yeah,
the resting stimulus.
yeah.
And I think probably my reflections over the years is just, I just get that sense of a lot of physiologists saying, you've got to cool down, you've got to cool down.
Hmm.
I'm just not sure. But this is in a different area, I
Yeah,
suppose. The cool down question for me has always still got to probably be answered at some point somewhere
yeah,
down the line. Are you getting more response out of your training if you don't cool down?
mm,
Um, and for me, perhaps if you looked at the bell curve of the sort of the normal distribution of people that this could be useful for, I think it's nearly everybody. It's
mm,
probably the elite athletes need some help enhancing, but most people doing a bit of training, not perhaps enough to get those elite
yeah,
level adaptations. Why not advance the adaptation? So
yeah.
it's a super fascinating question. I think it's got so many avenues that it could explore in the future.
And there's so many permutations to it.
Yeah,
This cool down, is it sort of recovering to prevent injury and other things like that. But yeah, in terms of adaptation, there's a whole black box there, and we could go down the avenue of doing cold baths and things like that to reduce the soreness. Well, that's been sort of the evidence is against it now because that again dampens the adaptation. There's good
yeah,
evidence that it reduces the adaptive response. So finding this sweet spot of recovering but augmenting the adaptation is absolutely, yeah, it's critical.
And so let's then let's start sort of diving into this idea of blood flow restriction, or occlusion as it's also known. Could you sort of do the essentials here in terms of, right, what is it?
Yeah. Okay. It's essentially you use inflatable cuffs. They don't have to be inflatable cuffs, and as it happens, I've got an example here on my shelf. I won't show the brand just yet, but there's an inflatable cuff, and that would be sort of positioned around the upper part of either the leg or the arm.
That looks like a leg one to me. I mean, that's a serious unit if that is an arm one.
That's a big gun. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Arnold level arm.
Yeah. There's my arm.
There's a cyclist's arm.
Yeah, absolutely. But so they're just like the blood pressure cuffs you would get in a doctor's office, and you place them around the upper part of the limb, inflate it. You tend not to completely occlude the limb. So if you occlude the limb, you're not really going to finish your exercise regime, because you're preventing complete blood flow, that you're preventing blood flow going in. So it's partial blood flow restriction. Around about, depends on the size of the limb, but 100, 120 millimeters of mercury. And what that does is that partially restricts the arterial inflow to the exercising limb, but completely restricts the venous outflow from the limb. So you're getting less blood in and no blood leaving. So the effect of that is you're reducing oxygen delivery for the leg, and you have to respire more anaerobically, for example, and then you're preventing the sort of removal of the metabolites accumulated in response to that exercise. And it's this combination. We don't know exactly, what the particular signals are, but the usual ones are: there's an element of hypoxia, so there's a low oxygen content. There's an increase in metabolic substrates, which may have signaling properties. There's a change in blood flow, of course, when you occlude, but also when you release the cuff, because you would release the cuff either after the exercise or whenever, and you get a greater blood flow response. You get a hyperemia response when you release the cuff. So all these signals, they're metabolic signals, they're hypoxic signals, they're shear stress signals, the blood flow over the surface of the blood vessels. These are the sort of primary physiological signals that are manipulated when you sort of restrict the limb, and they then trigger what I would call downstream molecular signals, so that sort of genetic machinery within the muscle fibers to sort of adapt the muscle, whether that's a growth in mitochondria, more capillaries, hypertrophy of the muscle fiber if you want to grow muscle fibers, and so on. So that's basically the nuts and bolts of the blood flow restriction method.
So mechanical and metabolic stress enhanced. So it's not easier necessarily. It's uncomfortable. It has some level of discomfort. You've got to be committed to this. You've got to want some improvements. But ultimately, that there is that knock-on effect, and so that is fairly secure in terms of the response. You're getting an enhanced response, and then you allude to some quite varied responses there, and maybe we can get into those, because I think that the three that we were probably going to talk about, but there's an extra one I think that might be emerging, that rehabilitation, the use for that, and we can get into the rationale and the methods for that. Strength-based or hypertrophy-based. Let's tackle those two together. Endurance, which is super interesting, and then recovery, enhancing recovery. And so it'd be great if I could sort of tap your knowledge for each of those in terms of where's the evidence at, maybe some example protocols, any differences in mechanisms if that's there. Where should we start? Should we start with rehab?
Yeah, what I'd suggest is we tie in the sort of strength and hypertrophy and rehab together.
Great.
I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Well, so if we talk about strength and hypertrophy, so the idea is that traditionally, if you want to grow muscle, you lift heavy weights. Okay, so 80% 1 rep max, I don't know, 10 to 11 reps, 3 or 4 sets, whatever that is, and you will grow muscle. And through the mechanisms of hypertrophy and the neural adaptations, you will get stronger. And the evidence suggests that using blood flow restriction, what you can do is you can reduce the relative sort of intensity of exercise. So you might be able to contract the muscles or use 20% 1 rep max. So you're reducing the load that you're lifting. And when you combine that with blood flow restriction, the usual 10 to 12 reps or even more with blood flow restriction, the evidence suggests that you get similar gains in hypertrophy and strength compared to high load resistance training. So the benefit is that you can dramatically reduce the load, 20-30% 1 rep max, and you get gains in strength and performance. And tying that into rehabilitation, if you say take an athlete that's torn their ACL ligament or has anterior knee pain and so on and so forth, they are load compromised. They might be going up towards surgical procedures, and their load is compromised, or they might be about to have surgery or have had surgery. You're not going to put high forces through that healing tendon or that healing ligament. So the idea with the sort of BFR with rehabilitation is that you can intervene quite early by dramatically reducing the load, even no load on. Combine that with blood flow restriction, and you can start that process of either reducing the decline in muscle size and atrophy with the injury, or accelerating the increase in hypertrophy much earlier following the injury or following the surgery. So you're sort of speeding up the return to play paradigm, as it were. So that's the evidence, and there's some really, the evidence base for the strength parameters, strength and hypertrophy parameters, and the rehabilitation is really quite strong. There's a very good sort of, body of knowledge with systematic reviews coming out now with increasing numbers of carefully controlled, randomized controlled trials that is really supporting the use of blood flow restricted exercise in that component of strength gains and rehabilitation for injured athletes. And it's really coming on quite strong now.
It's super interesting. And so that logic of being able to protect the structural tissues, whether that is bone, whether that is tendon, ligaments, and so on, from those mechanical stresses, whilst you're providing this blood flow restricted sort of metabolic focus, creating that stimulus for muscle repair, muscle growth, or muscle maintenance. And it's my head goes to the work of Brad Schoenfeld. He's had a lot of angst on social media, I think, from people that have tuned in, where his growing evidence and studies show that high repetition strength-based protocols are just as effective in growing muscle from that muscle hypertrophy point of view as the classic 8 to 10 reps. And it's like he's some sort of pariah for this, and people are saying, "Oh, that doesn't work. That's not right." Well, he's just presenting the evidence here. But multiple repetitions without necessarily the load is increasing the growth.
Yeah, I mean, it's really great work, and his work along with Stu Phillips's body of knowledge as well over in Canada, and it's really interesting, and I can see where the concerns are coming from the sort of the social media side of things, but perhaps people need to think about it in terms of, well, what's the stimulus for growth, and is it, and this is a very sort of broad stimulus, is it fatigue? Is fatigue or the components of fatigue the primary stimulus? So yes, you do sort of 8 to 12 reps of a high weight, you'll get fatigued by the end of that third set. If you're reducing the load and triple the number of reps, you're going to get to the same state of fatigueness within the muscle, but you've done more reps. And it's those metabolic molecular signals that are the triggers for adaptation. So how you get there doesn't matter. And it's the same with blood flow restriction. You put the cuff on, and you might sort of do less number of reps, compared to with, if you didn't have the blood flow cuff on, but you accelerate that fatiguing process, fatiguing in inverted commas. So you'll get to the same intramuscular status regardless, and that's the stimulus.
Yeah. And that's probably where it's useful to sort of differentiate this. If you want to lift heavy, or then there's a specific requirement for force through that structure.
Absolutely. But this is where it doesn't break down a little bit, but the translation from hypertrophy to functional strength is less clear. So yes, the blood flow restriction will grow muscle to the same extent as high load training. But the evidence for that translational into functional strength is less established, because you do need to be able, you do need to lift heavier weights to sort of induce that neural drive as well. So bigger muscles doesn't necessarily equal great, stronger muscles. It's a combination of both. So in terms of the rehabilitation and this paradigm of low rep or high reps, there's an argument of placing it at the correct point in time during the training regime and the training program. So you might start with low weights with blood flow restriction to get that initial spark, and then you will transition through to heavier weights as your tendon is healing and your ligaments are healing, to make sure that you can translate through to increasing strength. So it's a bit,
that's an important differentiation there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I suppose the logic there is clear, that if you are growing a greater sort of cross-sectional area of muscle fibers, that you are going to be stronger, but it's not just the muscle, and therefore there's the transfer of force to the bones and levers through the tendons. That maybe there's a question mark over that in terms of just how effective occlusion might be for those tissues too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
And I think that's a bit of there's not sort of knowledge around that, or not as good evidence around that, in the sense that you might be growing the muscle, but does that also translate to the tendons and ligaments as well?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so could you give us a couple of examples of what protocols people might use for either rehab or for strength?
I mean, again, this is a real open book, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it. So the classic method in the literature has been, I think it's something like 4 sets, and you start the first set doing 30 reps. So you apply the cuff and you inflate it, 30 seconds before your first set. You inflate it to the given pressure, which is another story. And then you would do 30 reps. You would then have a 1 minute interset recovery period, and then start the next set and maybe do 15 reps, and then repeat that 2 or 3 more times. So this 30, 15, 15, 15 profile. That came out of nowhere. We've used it in our studies, and it's just an arbitrary number of reps. The important thing is that you maintain the cuff pressure in that interset period.
Okay.
So the 1 minute recovery, you maintain that pressure. So by logic, by the 4th set, you might be really struggling to complete those 15 reps because of that metabolic burn and the sort of discomfort and sensation that the BFR provides. So that's one classic way. Other ways, you might do each set to fatigue. So the first set, you would occlude, you would restrict the blood flow. and just continue until you can't carry on. And that might be 30, 40, even 50 reps of, say, knee extension exercise with that 1 minute recovery period with the cuff maintained, and then continue. And by definition, your next sets, you might get 12 reps in the second, 6 reps in the third, and maybe 2 reps in the fourth, because it's such a stressful exercise. But again, you pretty much, the muscle gets to the same status by the end of that. The muscle is fatigued, inverted commas, and that's the stimulus. So the precise method is, there isn't a sort of a holy grail of I need to do this number of sets or reps. That hasn't been sort of optimized in many respects. So you do whatever works.
Okay, so some fundamental principles there are: you've got to put the work in. You've got to do something that probably gets the party started in terms of
absolutely.
Creating that level of fatigue state, metabolic soup, the lactic burn, as the athletics commentators will call it. So there's an important disclaimer there.
Yes.
And then subsequent exercise, so subsequent sets.
Yeah.
Quite frequently afterwards, so not much rest and maintenance. That seems to be another idea. And so you allude to the importance of the pressure, the arterial occlusion pressure, or AOP.
Yes.
Give us some guidance on that, because I think that probably, so you could be creative around the protocols, but perhaps there's less wriggle room on that one, as far as I understand.
Well, you might say that, but the wiggle room is quite wide anyway, if that makes sense. So if I define AOP first, so arterial occlusion pressure, what you would do, and this is quite well defined, is that before you start your exercise regime, you would test, and if you've got the appropriate level of type of cuffs, you would test the AOP. And effectively, you go through an internal self-calibration routine where you inflate, the cuff inflates to a suprasystolic pressure. So it's like having blood pressure measured. And then when you have blood pressure measured, the pressure reduces, and it waits and listens until it can sort of hear that arterial pulse. And that's the pressure at which the blood flow in the artery overcomes the restriction provided by the cuff. So the pressure at which the arteries are completely compressed, that's the AOP. So it might be, let's say, 130 millimeters of mercury systolic blood pressure, and then you would set a percentage of that. And the guidelines, which there's good evidence for them, but they're still quite broad. The guidelines are somewhere between 40 and 80% of AOP. Okay, so anywhere between that, you are producing some level of blood flow restriction. Obviously, the higher the pressure, 80% AOP, you'd produce more restriction, and 40 you would produce less restriction. So the guidelines are within that window of AOP, and that seems to be the sort of the rule of thumb at the moment.
And what would be your recommendation if someone was just starting out, for example? Maybe go a little bit lighter in terms of the percentage, just to get familiar with it, and then perhaps build that tolerance level up as they progress.
Absolutely. So like any sort of training regime that you're unfamiliar with, you would start slowly, inverted commas, and build up. So if you're unfamiliar with blood flow restriction, the first time you perform it, it's quite a shock, because you don't know what's happening, and you can feel that metabolic burn and you're hardly moving your leg. So yes, you would start at 40% AOP for a week or so, and as you would build up the number of sets and reps, and maybe the weight and the load, you would build up the arterial occlusion pressure, and you would program that into your regime. Absolutely. But there is a sort of, you do get quite familiar with blood flow restriction quite quickly. That first session is like, oh my God, what's going on? What's happening to my leg? And in some of the studies, everyone, this is horrendous. But you do become a little bit more desensitized to it as you get used to it.
I think that's important for people to recognize, that there's
Yeah.
a familiarity that's necessary to that. And I think that expectation of what I can do normally, and then adjusting, say, for example, to a percentage of 1 RM is easy to do the maths, but then the sensation is different and potentially more intense. That if you're fatiguing after, say, 12 reps, that's under normal circumstances, it's going to feel very different with occlusion at 12 and 15 and 20 reps. It's going to feel very different and intense. And almost, I think, from a practical point of view, feedback I've had from athletes, but also playing with it myself, is you've got to really commit to those last few reps. It's a mental thing as much as anything. You probably can lift the thing. It's just going to feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when those last few reps, particularly of the last set, you think you're never going to move your leg again, and it is a real struggle, and that's for obvious reasons. So, but when the cuff is released, you think, oh, okay, yeah, I can see that now. But the other thing to flip that slightly is what also sort of surprises people is that it feels so hard when they know the load is so low as well. You put you have a sort of 2 kilogram dumbbell, and you could just lift that all day, and then you put a blood pressure cuff on, inflate it, and then you're struggling after 15 reps, and that's really strange as well. And in laboratory practicals that we run here with our students, it's like, oh my God, what is this? What is this weird thing? And yeah, that's the importance of blood flow.
This episode of Supporting Champions podcast is sponsored by Athlete Now, the perfect platform for sports practitioners looking to expand their reach. Whether you're a sports scientist, therapist, or coach, Athlete Now helps you showcase your expertise, connect you directly with athletes, and grow your business. With no ads, no commissions, and access to industry discounts, is designed to make your services stand out. Join as a practitioner today to get listed, promote your services, and connect with athletes who need your support. And for athletes, it's free to sign up, giving you access to exclusive discount deals and direct connections with the best in the industry. Visit theathletenow.com to find out more. Listening, folks, get some occlusion cuffs and take them with you to your hotel trips so that you don't have to carry weights with you if they haven't got a gym. You can put some occlusion cuffs on and lift a few chairs up or
baked bean cans.
The kettle.
Yeah. But that's what we do. Sort of a slight segue from elite athletes. We've just finished a clinical feasibility trial in COPD patients.
Right.
So these are patients that are frail, they're ill, and they are limited to perform exercise because of their lung disease. They've been doing blood flow restricted body weight exercise. So they would sit on a chair and they would just lift their leg with no weights on it at all. Or they might do sort of just hold onto a chair and just squat carefully up and down. And with the blood flow restriction cuffs on, they've been understanding the sort of the benefits of exercise, and we're analyzing the data at the moment. But it translates across parameters and paradigms from elite athletes that we're talking about to frail, chronic disease patients, and that's the strength of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That's interesting from the point of view just lifting daily functional capacity, which I would assume, and this maybe is a segue, but I would assume would then have a knock-on effect for how much they can do, and that sense of a VO2 max or an aerobic capacity as well, lifting that ceiling as well, because otherwise you can end up getting a sort of your functional strength very close to what you can manage aerobically.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's move on to endurance then. So we've sort of rehabbed and strength covered those topics, and so the evidence there is fairly firm and strong that there's a benefit there of lower loading or lower force, but maintaining fatigue and stresses for strength and hypertrophy
Yeah.
reasons. Endurance is interesting, and immediately my head goes to, we've got the same mechanisms in play for endurance or not, but also, you don't. I can cope with 15 reps. I can cope with 30 reps. That's a hard effort. But endurance, are we talking about putting the cuffs on limbs such as, like, say, legs for cycling during exercise, or just in recovery, or both?
You can do both, Steve.
Okay.
So again, there are different sort of ways of applying the blood flow restriction, and you would usually do it during a sort of an interval type exercise. You can do it during continuous exercise, maybe sort of 15, 20 minutes. And I've just reviewed an article that's a really nice article that has used, a 20-minute bout of exercise with continuous blood flow restriction, and it was very interesting. But there is using the paradigm of interval exercise, and that might be low intensity interval. So again, the same paradigm in this respect applies as with the strength training. You would use interval exercise, let's say 2-minute intervals with 2 minutes recovery, and do, say, 3 or 4 sets of those. And you could apply the cuff during the interval whilst you're exercising, and then release for that recovery period. So again, the load would be low, or the work rate would be low, and that blood flow restriction augments the sort of physiological response, and it feels as if you are doing a high intensity interval exercise. Okay. The other paradigm is you maintain the intensity. So you would do a high intensity interval exercise session, and you would apply the blood flow restriction cuffs immediately after completing each interval. So you would perform, 2 minutes of 80% VO2 max, or whatever it is, finish the exercise bout and apply the cuffs. Maintain the cuff pressure for 2 minutes or so, release it and have another minute of recovery, and then start your next interval. So that's another paradigm. And then what we've done in the past, which is where Connor Taylor did his PhD following our initial coffee conversation, we've combined it with sprint interval exercise. So in those studies, we did 4 maximal sprints. So the classic 30-second Wingate sprint, and apply the cuff instantly after completing that sprint. And they might do 4 or 5 reps with a 4-minute recovery. So the 2 minutes immediately post sprint would be cuff on, inflated, another 2 minutes to recover a little bit more, and then start the next sprint. So there's different ways of incorporating blood flow restriction to this sort of endurance type exercise.
And so I'm assuming there we're talking about a lower percentage of AOP, that pressure, or occlusion, or does that not matter?
I think it's the same. It's, again,
Okay.
I mean, we've used absolute pressures, so we just put it up at 120 millimeters of mercury. We did have to increase the pressure a little bit to sort of increase that metabolic sense of something happening, if that's a sort of a vague way of describing it. So we have gone up a little bit in that post exercise recovery blood flow
so
restriction.
Feedback there that I didn't really notice the cuff was on.
Yeah. So let's pump it up a bit more and let's see what happens.
Okay.
It's as vague as that. So yeah, but you're in that same ballpark of, it's not complete occlusion. It is a percentage of AOP that you would use during the exercise, and then that post-exercise recovery rest period.
So some potential options there in terms of during the effort, during the recovery, or potentially both if you're completely masochistic.
Yeah, but then you won't finish your exercise. You won't finish your bout.
No, but I guess if the biggest principle here is it's just got to hurt more, it's just got to distress the system more, you might not do as much either way.
True.
Or something's got to give in terms of the training load or
Hmm.
increased in perceived exertion. Do you have any sense of any superiority around those protocols?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That's a really good question. I think, God, I mean, you could spitball a lot. I don't know. I think it depends what you're after. I think it depends what the goal of that training block is. I mean, we did a really nice case report with some of our university cycling team here, where we stratified either using the low intensity blood flow restriction during the exercise or the higher intensity interval sprint type exercise with post exercise restriction, depending upon the level of the athlete. So we had cyclists that had were very experienced and had already had a high volume of training, and we suspected that they could tolerate the higher intensity work with the post exercise blood flow restriction better and more compared to those less talented athletes, or that's the wrong word, less athletes that had less training volume history. We tailored those to the lower intensity work, and we still saw similar gains regardless of which method they used. And this is only sort of 5 or 6 athletes, but so there was evidence that both worked to some extent, but it was all depending upon the training history of the athletes that were used at that time.
And any differentiation in terms of the capacity? So you hint to the maturity of the athlete in terms of training volume and experience. Was there any hierarchy in terms of aerobic capacity, for example?
I can't remember. I don't think so. I mean, they were good athletes, but it was all about how experienced they were and how much training volume history they had had previously. So they all had decent engines in the
Yeah,
first
okay.
place. Yeah.
I've got an old hangover theory hypothesis from training camps that if you take, so this was from the sort of rowing days, if you take 25 athletes away on a rowing hard altitude training camp, there's going to be some people who fall down, miss sessions, get ill,
Mm.
especially as it gets closer and closer to Olympic selection. And it was almost certainly there was a coincidence that the ones with the smaller engines went down first,
Mm.
and the ones with the big engines are the most likely to be able to complete all the training.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Interesting.
just a indirect hypothesis there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so are we talking about similar sort of mechanisms, but on a sort of a smaller, lower intensity sort of level in terms of shear stress, blood flow, increased capillarization? Or are we also then seeing that increase in mitochondrial biogenesis with the lower loads that we wouldn't necessarily be experiencing with the strength and the rehab, higher force experiences? But we're seeing a differentiation in the mechanism of adaptation.
Do you mean between strength and hypertrophy and endurance?
Yeah, if you're doing an endurance
adaptation?
protocol,
Yeah.
you're seeing different adaptations.
Yeah, for sure. No, well, I mean, our focus, my own particular focus has been on the sort of endurance adaptations around angiogenesis, so capillary growth, and mitochondrial biogenesis, so the growth of and the change in function of mitochondria. And regardless of which method of BFR that we use, whether it's sprint interval training or the lower intensity interval training, you get an upregulation of those signals for capillarity, for angiogenesis and mitochondrial biogenesis. So and again, they come about due to the sort of, again, we don't know which particular ones are key, but it's the same sort of physiological signals of hypoxia, metabolic changes, reactive oxygen species, changes. And in terms of the angiogenic response, this shear stress, which is a key stimulus for angiogenesis. So when you get the increase in blood flow, the flow of blood over the surface of the capillary cells, that is a key signal for angiogenesis. So we are seeing an upregulation of these signals, and in other studies that there's been sort of demonstration of changes in mitochondrial function and mitochondrial biogenesis and indications of angiogenesis as well. So yeah, we're talking about those kind of mechanisms. Yeah.
Potentially a stupid question, but I'm always good for that. But is there any, if you're doing endurance-based protocols or endurance-based training interventions, are you seeing any offshoot almost of hypertrophy with this type of exposure? I'm just interested in terms of some athletes would be allergic to increasing muscle mass when they're trying to keep their body mass down.
I think there is a thought that might occur.
Okay.
The evidence base, as far as I'm aware, is less clear. So I can't answer that directly, but I think there is some suggestion that there may be. I don't know to what extent, but there might be. I don't think it's been investigated to the same extent during endurance type work as it has been with, of course, strength and hypertrophy, that side of the coin. So, but there is some logic that it might. But I think the evidence is a little less clear yet.
Yeah, and I assume that you're not going to be using it every session anyway, and therefore the prevailing volume of stimulus is going to be for the same stimulus that would strip back muscle, keep you light, reduce body fat, etc. Anyway.
No, the whole idea of layering blood flow restriction into a training block is another big question for us. If we talk about cyclists, they might be training 20, 25, 28 hours a week of high volume endurance work with interval sessions here and there. Where you layer the blood flow restriction sessions into that weekly microcycle, that's a big question. In our studies, we would do it twice a week. We've done one study where it's 3 times a week, and the subjects were broken by the end of it. So that was not great. We got the adaptation we wanted, but they couldn't perform. So that's not ideal. So do we tailor it to 1 session a week that you would replace the BFR session? You would replace an interval session, a classic interval, with a BFR session. They're the questions that need unpicking at the moment.
Yeah, and just to riff on that, I think my suggestion, if I'm writing training programs for people, is something like once a fortnight is a good way to start that process, to try things out, and then integrate it into maybe 1 session per week as a simple starter for 10, and for cyclists, that's relatively easy on a stationary bike, for example, but equally for other athletes, rowers, runners, for example, it could be that there's a modified type of training session that's not mode specific. So runners on cross trainers, for example, as an example, that might be a place where you might play around with that type of thing, if not in the recovery phases after a track session, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. No, the practicality of BFR is a major, I wouldn't say a limitation, but a major hurdle to overcome.
Yeah.
In terms of, these are the cuffs that we use. There are other sort of more practical products out there, but where to incorporate it into an endurance athlete's training regime is a really big question. So, for example, there's a PhD student here who's a coach for, world-class ultra endurance runners. These guys are running 90-kilometer sort of races over mountains and so on. And, incorporating blood flow restriction during that sort of training session would be nigh on impractical. But they would build it into a stair session. They've got an indoor stair treadmill, and I've got a brilliant photograph of him from Doug, and he's incorporating BFR during his chairlift sessions. So using some sort of sideways thinking to incorporate it is probably the way the way forward.
There's infinite possibilities, but equally there's some probably limited opportunities that you could make this happen. And so we've sort of explored rehab, we've explored strength and hypertrophy and endurance, and increasingly you're starting to think about whether it could be used for recovery. And I know this is shaky in terms of limited evidence, if any, but what's emerging from your conversations in this area?
So, I will admit, up until about a month ago, I was a little bit I'd seen some reports on it, and I'd seen some not much literature on it, and that was probably my main beef about it, in terms of using it in that classic recovery sense from hard exercise. But I've had some really interesting conversations with colleagues in different sports, and they are increasingly thinking of using it or starting to use it in that classic recovery sense. I guess my criticism at the time, up until about a month ago, was I'm not sure what the mechanisms would be to encourage recovery in that sense, because you're occluding or restricting the blood flow, you're preventing that whatever it is, the flushing away of metabolites and that sort of removal of damaged tissue and so on and so forth. So that was my perhaps naive perspective from it. But the conversations I've had have educated me in many senses, in the sense that you think about a cyclist, and they've ridden a 6-hour Tour de France stage, and then they have to jump on a bus within an hour to get to the start of the next stage. And on that bus, they are probably stationary for maybe an hour or two, sometimes longer. I don't know. I haven't been on a tour on a tour stage. For a cyclist, they have to start recovering instantly, and you can see them drinking their shakes when they're having the TV interviews. That's their recovery process starting. So on a bus, when they're stationary, are there ways, and are teams starting to use blood flow restriction in that sense? I mean, I think they are, and my conversations with a couple of teams have suggested that's what they're doing. The evidence base is zero as far as I'm aware. So that was my scientific concern. Similarly, with another colleague in UK athletics, Andy Shaw, he comes from it from a perspective of, and you would know more about this, middle distance athletes having heats in the morning and then the semi-final in the afternoon, and you have to recover and prepare for the next event, 3 or 4 hours later. Same in an IP or a TP event around a velodrome. So can BFR be incorporated in that sense? Now, like I said, the evidence base, I don't know. I haven't seen anything in that perspective. Even from the classic recovery sense of, recovering from damaging exercise, DOMS. We all talk about DOMS, sore legs, and can BFR be used to sort of speed up the recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage? There's one study as far as I'm aware. So the evidence base is very limited, but I'm curious about it, and my curiosity has been tapped by these really interesting conversations with, a World Tour cycling team and Shawsey at UK Athletics. So we need to do some work on this. What the mechanism would be, what are you recovering there? I've got no idea. Is it inflammation? Are you enhancing glycogen resynthesis? I've got no idea. Um,
Okay, but then there is often science follows the coaching, and
yes, it does.
that sense of what edge have we got? Let's try stuff out. How do you feel? That might be a barometer. As you say, there's that sense of hyperemia, blood flow post blood flow restriction.
Yeah, I mean,
There's often a mental aspect of that. God, I feel different.
yeah,
I feel exhausted, or I feel pumped afterwards.
yeah.
Um,
I just don't
yeah,
buy the. I mean, I can see, and it's something that I've thought about this post-restriction reactive hyperemia. I mean, it's classic physiology. You occlude the limb, you release it, you get a massive overshoot in blood flow it's delivered to replace, the deoxygenated blood in the limb. But it's very short-lived. It's a very short response, and it depends upon the level of occlusion that you've provided. So,
yeah.
I'm just not convinced that this reactive hyperemia is enough in that sense to promote recovery.
Uh,
You may as well just, as the cyclists do, pedal on the bike for 25 minutes. You see them pedaling on the bike straight after a 6-hour tour stage. That's part of the recovery process. Now, whether BFR provides that, I don't know, but I'm
yeah, okay.
curious.
So, I mean, I've got a slide that I'm not going to get a Nobel Prize for, but it's how to get fit. And the simple thing is provide a training stimulus that you then there's a blood flow and provision of nutrients, and then there's a third point, which is no further stress. For me, that would include shopping. Then
Yeah,
and then there's a cascade of response of
yeah,
intracellular signaling and so on. Then you get fitter. And so that for me might be that it sounds like there's a sound rationale along the lines of contrast bathing, active walking, provision of blood flow, massage of tissues, etc., etc. Maybe some of these stimulation devices that are out there providing blood flow, or it seems as though increasingly the switch from cold bathing to warm bathing, there's an enhanced blood flow aspect there.
yeah.
But what I would be cautious about that recovery is that blood flow restriction creates a stress.
Yeah.
So is that enhancing the need for further recovery? Or increasing, should I say? So that would be my concern or worry there. But
But maybe no, I completely agree with you. But maybe in this sense, and this is the interesting conversation that I'm going to have tomorrow, as it happens, or is just the practicality of BFR with particular devices and with particular garments might just give them a very small percentage, whatever it is, in that you got an hour sitting on your backside where you can't do anything because of the nature of the Tour de France stage, or you have to then go to a holding pen, following your 800-meter heat or whatever. That's probably anything, even if it doesn't work, but it doesn't do any harm, that might be good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I mean, maybe my head again would go to the these stimulation devices. What are they called? Ferg, that go on the back of your calf, for example, and so on.
The on pulse. Yeah.
And you're right. When you're creating a protocol for an elite athlete, you've got to have the backups, because you can't necessarily just have jacuzzis in your team bus.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You might need something practical that you can wear in your seat, like warming trousers or something like that.
Exactly.
Interesting. I mean, it's just useful and interesting to explore, a bit like those sort of original conversations.
Yeah.
Last couple of questions, though, for you folk. Who's using this? Who's actually using this? I mean, there's a case that this could improve performance for a range of people, from elite athletes to people who are regular gym users through to recreational cyclists. But how common is it?
I mean, that's a great question. I genuinely don't know. And I've been, shouting about the benefits of it in terms of adaptation for over 10, 12 years now. But I don't know. Anecdotally, again, seeing a bit of social media and in conversations with scientific colleagues and other coaches, I do know that some high performing elite cyclists are using it. Interestingly, a World Tour cycling team have just agreed a partnership with a blood flow restriction apparel company. So that triggered curiosity, who I'm going to chat to tomorrow. I have on good knowledge that, I've seen photos of Tadej Pogacar using it. Now, whether they're using it for training adaptation or rehabilitation post-crash, for example, I don't know. I've had it on good knowledge that Jonas Vingegaard used it. He had a horrendous crash last year, got back in time for the Tour de France and did fairly well at the end of it. I've had good, anecdotal evidence that he was using it at some point in his rehabilitation. I don't know how or in what way. So elite athletes are using it. I was talked about this high performing endurance ultramarathon runner that uses it routinely in his training cycle. So I know it's used, but I don't know to what extent, and I don't know to what, why they're using it, how they're using it, or what protocols they're using, what devices they're using, what cuff pressures they're using, and things like that. So these are things that I'm really interested in.
And are you capturing that?
Okay, a nice segue. So we've just embarked on a bit of a survey. So I'm working with a couple of excellent colleagues in Australia, Brendan Scott and Paul Goods at Murdoch University. And about 2 weeks ago, we launched a survey that is designed for practitioners, coaches, and athletes to basically ask these questions. It's an initial sort of online survey, and then we might, if you're interested in, we would follow up with an interview and do some focus groups and so on to basically ask these questions. Who's using it? Why? Are you happy with it? Do you think it's safe? Because safety is another important component that we need to consider. So yeah, it's really interesting to find out. So yeah, thanks for the plug.
Yeah, well, okay. So there's a call to action. If you are regularly training at a high level, then and you are using blood flow restriction, then fill in the forms in the link in the description. And thank you, because this feels to me as like an area that has untapped potential, and it does need corralling a little bit in terms of understanding what's out there. Okay, so that'll be really interesting, and that there could be some follow up there. What just lastly though, have you got any sort of specific recommendations in terms of kit? Not necessarily brands per se, but if you're going to do this, don't use a tourniquet homemade device sort of wrapping it around your arm. Just what's your sense in terms of, look, there's some technology that does some of the measurement and calibration and control there for you. Is that worth it? Would you encourage that?
I mean, that's a really great question. And again, a year ago, I would be saying things like, only use cuffs like this. This is a kind of blood pressure type cuff, and it's connected to an inflating device. Okay. They're getting much better now. You don't have to even have a tube connected to the inflating device. They have the inflator sort of located on it, and they are controlled by apps, and it controls the AOP. It measures the AOP. It controls carefully the cuff pressure. And so on, because my previous thought would be don't, and the wider they are, the better. Okay, so the wider the cuffs, for a girth, for a given girth, the better, because you don't have to inflate it up to such a high pressure to induce a given amount of blood flow restriction. So what I was advocating not to do is take your belt off and wrap it around your limb and tighten it with your teeth. Don't do that, because you're going to completely occlude, and probably induce some nerve damage. There is an apparel company that's out there now that is a tourniquet device, and that it's an elastic strap or a Velcro strap that goes round the limb, and it's a Velcro based device that induces the blood flow restriction, and that's getting traction because it's less cumbersome than these devices.
Right.
Now, whether it is, and this is my chat tomorrow I keep alluding to, which I'm really excited about, whether it is safe and whether it is, sort of provides that blood flow restriction, they'll convince us, and the data I've seen is very interesting. So I think using it depends upon the situation. This is a much more practical way of doing it, but you can still use these devices in a more controlled and rigorous manner. So I don't know is my answer at the moment. I know that's a
I know
really
what you mean.
response,
it feels like that spectrum of sleep monitors, for example, that you just wouldn't, if you're just casually interested in your sleep quality, you wouldn't go off to a sleep lab and get polysomnography. You just wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Having done that, I wouldn't recommend it. That's just bad sleep.
Yeah.
But wearing a ring or a watch, whilst it might not necessarily be the most convenient or comfortable, people tolerate it. And whilst it might not give the same quality of information, it enhances the practicality, and importantly, it acquires the data.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that might be, and also, I guess, in that instance, it might not be the best or gold standard, but it might open up the possibilities of you being able to try that, whether that is canoeing, for example, or swimming or rowing, for example, where it might not be as practical to have devices stuck to your leg with inflators sticking out the side.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it's a really interesting device company, and it's going down that line of greater practicality, which makes perfect sense, because that's always been the limitation in our work in the labs. It's always been, getting the best method that is practical as well, and it works, and the cuffs don't slip down the arm or slip down your leg when you're cycling even if it's on your turbo trainer. That's always been a potential limitation to these more complex, accurate devices. Absolutely.
Super interesting conversation, Ferg. Thanks so much for sharing your insights, your knowledge, but also just extending that kind of could be what might be in the future, and the possibilities that are starting to emerge. Practitioners starting to challenge you, by the sounds of it, in terms of stretching this particular area, because it does feel like there's performance gain to be had if applied intuitively, intelligently to performance. So thanks so much for the conversation, and anyone listening, fill in Ferg's survey and let us know what you're up to.
That's great. Yeah, I would really appreciate that, and thanks for the conversation, Steve. It's been a real pleasure.
Brilliant.
As always.